Hello everybody, welcome back to High Ground. My name is Tanner, and today we're going to be talking about the new rosters for the North America League for Rainbow Six Siege's 2023 season, stage number 2. Parabellum dropped out of the league, but we have two new teams joining in Wildcard and Luminosity, and we also have a bunch of other roster changes from among the other teams. Only two teams actually not making any roster changes coming into the stage, so lots of stuff to talk about. Let's get into it. We'll start with the teams that didn't make any changes and work our way up. First off, M80 is Diaz Lucas, Kino, Gomez, Iconic, and Spoit. Diaz, Kino, and Gomez in particular have been playing together on this roster for quite some time now. Iconic and Spoit are still relatively new, but not brand new by any means. And this is a team with a lot of talent. People have very high expectations for this team. They didn't quite live up to them in stage 1. They got off to sort of a poor start in the round robin phase, but it was good enough to get them into the deciders, the playoffs. And from there, they were able to secure the first seed from North America going into the Copenhagen Major, where they didn't do spectacularly. They were one of the worst performing NA teams along with Dark Zero, outdone by SSG and certainly by Sonics. But they did play at Gamers 8 over the off season. They weren't invited directly to the event like Oxygen was, but they were invited directly to the qualifier where they beat Dark Zero in the final to make it to the event. They impressively made it all the way to the grand final, but were then pretty unceremoniously dispatched of by BDS 3-0. So even though they didn't do too well at the major, they do have a pretty good international performance under their belts in Gamers 8. Next up, we have Sonics, who are the only other team that didn't make any changes coming into the stage. Grixer and Rexon are now the longest standing duo in North America League. Filling out the rest of the roster, we have Geo, Gunner, and Citizen. So another roster with a ton of talent. Geo and Gunner have been around for a solid amount of time on this team, and Citizen still relatively new, kind of like Iconic and Spoit on M80, but not brand new by any means. Sonics sort of had the opposite stage 1 that M80 did. Sonics did well in the round robin, unlike M80. They were a bit shaky at times, but still they were good enough to place third, and then they immediately fell out of the deciders into the LCQ, whereas M80 cruised all the way to being the first seed from North America at Copenhagen. But Sonics did go all the way through the LCQ, and in fact they made it all the way through phase 1 of the major, phase 2 of the major, and into phase 3 of the major, where they were able to secure a top 4 finish just like they did at the previous major. They had a little bit of a rough SI, but they have a really solid major performance on either end of it to make up for it. And so even though they had a very different performance from M80 in stage number 1, they both look to be top dogs coming into the stage. Probably along with Dark Zero, they are the 3 teams to beat, looking like there's only going to be one more slot for any given team to make it to the major from North America. And since I just mentioned them, let's talk about Dark Zero next. Rice still hasn't been officially announced as their final player, but for all intents and purposes, it is known that he will be their last player. So that makes it Rice, NJR, Pambazoo, Canadian, and Gaveni. And this is a scary looking roster. They had just a bit of growing pains, I'd say, when Gaveni joined the roster, and they've had trouble finding a solid 5th. And I guess before and after Gaveni joined the roster, they've had the likes of Hyper, Eclipse, Skies, Achieved, and now Rice. So again, yeah, really struggling to find that solid 5th man to accompany the rest of the team. NJR, Pambazoo, and Gaveni as a 3-man squad have honestly looked incredible. With Canadian at the helm, nobody better to lead a team than probably the best IGL of all time, and depending on who you ask, the best player of all time. So Rice certainly has a lot of expectations on his shoulder joining such a team, but if his performance in the offseason is any indication, he should be up to the task. Next up is Oxygen, who just like Dark Zero made a single roster change in the offseason, but theirs came quite a lot sooner. Fish even played with them at Gamers 8. So the roster now is Foxay, Newers, Dream, Yaga, and again Fish. Fish coming on to replace Sweater, who not too long ago replaced Laxing. I guess the Sweater addition to the team just didn't end up working out, even though they did have that very impressive top 3 finish at SI, which allowed them to go to Gamers 8, where they didn't have a spectacular performance, but they didn't go out winless, and their losses did come to some pretty solid teams. Of all of the teams that didn't go to the major from NA, they were probably the one that you would have most expected to be able to take the spot from one of the other 4 teams. They didn't miss out by a massive margin. They ended up losing to Sonics in the LCQ, so they didn't even make it to the final. But had they been on the other side of the bracket, they probably would have, where I guess they would have lost to Sonics anyways based on the semifinals performances. And though the roster has changed over time, they have generally qualified for majors more times than not. So maybe missing out in stage 1 was just a bit of a fluke. In 2021 and 2022, they only missed out on one major each year. They've already missed out on one major this year, so maybe that means that they will not be missing out on the following one. We'll see what happens. And the final team to only make one roster change coming into the stage is Space Station. They replaced Merc with Ashen, making the roster full Hot and Cold, Forest, J9L, and Ashen. And Ashen is probably one of the most anticipated players to join T1 of all time. He's not quite Bolo or Spoit, but he is sort of in that same boat of players where as soon as they turned 18, they got picked up. This was expected to happen, and they were also expected to do big things. And Bolo did it, and Spoit did it, and let's see if Ashen can do it. For quite some time, he played on a really strong T3 team for a good amount of time, probably the best team in T3 with some other really solid players, but he was probably the most hyped up player of them all. And let's see if he can not quite turn things around for Space Station, because they actually did pretty well in stage number 1, but they've also been quite a shaky team. They've been 7-0'd 3 times in stage 1, once by Dark Zero, once by M80, and once by Wolves at the major, so if you count that as stage number 1. But they placed second in the round robin, and then third place overall from NA, giving them the 3rd seed at the Copenhagen major from NA, where they were actually the 2nd best performing team from NA. They only managed to make it to the top 11. They were eliminated in the final round of Swiss by Scars, but still those are some pretty solid placements overall compared to all of the other NA teams. So pretty good stuff on the macro scale. Yes, there are a few things to work on. Getting 7-0'd that many times is a little bit tough, but they did have to combine sort of old Astralis and old Space Station and Merc, so maybe now they're a little bit more of a cohesive unit and they just have to bring on the one player in Ashen. It seems like in their time on the offseason that they're still working things out. They haven't quite figured out their roles, or maybe they have now, but they hadn't at the time. So we'll see what they do going forward. I think just like Oxygen, people do have a few questions about this team. They're not sure if they're going to be top dogs just yet, but we'll have to see. I do think that they did surprise some people in stage number 1, doing as well as they did with jamming together as many pieces as they did. Next up, let's talk about Beast Coast. They retained Doc, Hat, and Mr. B, but they replaced Hyper and Vertical with Reverse and Spiff. This will be Reverse's debut stage in T1 play, but Spiff played at the most recent SI along with Astralis, where they did place top 4, so an impressive debut for him. And then he played on Parabellum in the most recent stage of the NAL, where he wasn't terrible, I guess, but his team kind of was, only getting 4 points over the whole stage and placing last. These 2 pickups look to be a bit of a gamble. They replaced their 2 super veterans in Hyper and Vertical with 2 not absolute newbies, because again, I guess Spiff has some experience, but Reverse is an absolute newbie, and it's not like anyone else on Beast Coast has a ton of experience, Doc, Hat, or Mr. B. And so we'll see how it pans out for them. I guess if you're not one of the top dog teams and you can't get just anybody you want, if you have to sort of make something work, you're gonna have to take a gamble eventually. I think people don't have a ton of faith in Beast Coast. It's going to have to be one of those situations where they prove people wrong, but I think it's entirely possible. I think a lot of people do have faith in Mr. B, but maybe not in the rest of his team. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, Hat was really impressive. Mr. B had his moments, and I guess all eyes will be on Spiff, and especially Reverse, being as new as he is. And then we have Mirage with only 2 returning players in Kansan and Rampy. Joining them are Slothy, Spiker, and Vertical. Slothy, I think, has been on the bench for this team for some amount of time. Spiker coming over from Parabellum, and Vertical coming over from Beast Coast, and before that he was on Oxygen. So at this point, Mirage is like a super hodgepodge. I guess it kind of was before, but Kansan from Sonics, Rampy from Space Station, Spiker from Parabellum, and Vertical from Beast Coast / Oxygen. So we'll see how they fare. They've had a good amount of time in the offseason to make this team work, and they've had some okay showings. They made it all the way to the grand final of the Game Rogue Summer Series, where they got 3-0'd by Oxygen. So yeah, they did get 3-0'd, but at least it's to one of the better North American teams. And they lost in the quarterfinals of Breaking Point to SSG. It was a 2-0, but again, at least it was against a solid team. And so just like Beast Coast, I think a lot of people don't have super high expectations for Mirage, but at least they do have a fair amount of experience going for them on this team in Rampy, Vertical, and Kansan, with Slothy and Spiker being fairly new, but Beast Coast has 5 players that are fairly new. So maybe they'll be able to make some upsets by way of that, or maybe they'll just straight up be better than people expect them to be. And finally, let's talk about the 2 new teams, and neither of them are actually new as far as the orgs go. Wildcard has been involved in Siege for a while, and Luminosity is a past T1 NA org, and they've actually been involved in non-T1 NA for some amount of time, but they are now making their return to T1. So let's talk about them. Starting with Wildcard, we have Merc, Spirits, Surf, Adam, and Packer. And if you know NA at all, you should recognize a few of these names, specifically Merc and Spirits, maybe Surf as well. He's played on a few different rosters now. And to round it out, we have a few new players in Adam and Packer. And if you follow T2, you probably know these names as well. Adam used to be known as Tra, and Packer did get picked up by Parabellum at one point, but the whole roster was dropped in favor of another roster before Packer actually had a chance to play an NAL game. And if you weren't paying attention, I think you sort of missed out because Wildcard was holding sort of public trials for who they were going to pick up onto their team. And it was a little bit of a Mickey Mouse fest, honestly, because some players did well and didn't end up getting picked up. I think it was mostly for the spectacle. And I mean, most of the players that did get picked up did either pretty good or very well. So, I mean, you can't knock them too hard, but there's probably at least one player that was pretty notably snubbed that we won't really get into here. And so I think this makes Wildcard sort of like Mirage in that it's just a hodgepodge of players. Merc used to play on TSM and then he played on SSG. Spirits played on Parabellum and then Xset, and Surf played on Beast Coast and then Mirage. And so there's a good amount of experience from among those three to go with the two rookies in Adam and Packer. It's hard to imagine that these guys will do excellently right out of the gate because of the fashion that they were just thrown together. They don't even have that much experience together in the offseason, unlike some of the other teams. So it's another situation where I guess we'll see. I wouldn't set my expectations too high, but I mean, if you're a fan of any of these players or the org or something, I guess you can at least be hopeful that they'll put up some solid performances. And last, but potentially not least, we have Luminosity, Asian, Eddie, Silent, Snake, and Twist. This is actually most of the SSG Academy roster from the offseason. We have Eddie, Silent, and Snake returning from that roster, but instead of Mohesi and Rice, we have Asian and Twist. There's not a ton of T1 experience on this roster, but that's not to say that there's none. Asian played on Parabellum for a single stage where he was pretty uninspiring. But Snake did play on TSM for also only one stage, but they did make the major, and they also made top 8 of that major, being eliminated by Sonics. So although Snake's stint in Pro League was pretty short as well, it was pretty solid, all things accounted for. And so I guess I'd compare Luminosity to Beast Coast more so than Mirage and Wildcard. And I mentioned the 4 of them because I think in most people's eyes, those are, at the moment, the bottom 4 teams in the league that need to prove themselves as not bottom 4 teams. Like I mentioned before, Mirage and Wildcard are sort of just mixes of players all thrown together, whereas Luminosity and Beast Coast have a core of players that have played together recently. On Luminosity, that being the former SSG Academy players, and on Beast Coast, that'd be Doc, Hat, and Mr. B. And there's also not a whole lot of T1 experience on either of those teams. And I think that's all of the basics pretty well covered. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, corrections, any of that stuff, feel free to leave it below in the comments. I always like to read and have a little conversation with people about the subject of the video or just whatever. And a like and a subscription would be very much appreciated. And with all that being said, I will catch you guys next time.